The rain pattered against the tall glass windows of Chen's penthouse office as he stared at the old family photo on his phone. 15 years had passed since he'd walked away from everything that once meant the world to him. His fingers traced the screen, lingering over the image of his little girl's smile. She had been just 5 then, with her mother's warm brown eyes and his determined chin. That fateful morning played in his mind like a movie he couldn't stop watching. The morning dew had still clung to the grass as he loaded his bags into the car. His wife, Mai, had stood on the porch, arms crossed, eyes red from crying through the night. Their daughter, Lin, clutched her mother's leg, too young to understand that Daddy wasn't coming back this time. "Your empire awaits, Mr. Chen," his assistant's voice cut through his memories, placing a stack of documents on his desk. He barely nodded, his mind still lost in the past. His company, Chen Tech Solutions, had grown from a small startup to a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Every magazine called him a genius, a visionary, the next big thing in Silicon Valley. But sitting in his leather chair, surrounded by awards and accolades, Chen felt nothing but emptiness. The city lights twinkled below his office, a testament to his success. He'd chosen this, the sleepless nights, the endless meetings, the thrill of building something revolutionary. But at what cost? He couldn't remember the sound of Lin's laughter or the way May's eyes crinkled when she smiled. His phone buzzed with another notification about a successful merger. 15 years ago, that's all he'd wanted, to prove himself, to build something meaningful. He'd convinced himself that leaving was the only way. The small town they lived in was suffocating his ambitions. May's dreams of running her small bookstore and raising their daughter in a close-knit community seemed to clash with his grand visions. "Your 7 p.m. meeting is waiting, sir," his assistant reminded him. Chen waved her away, standing to look out over the city he'd conquered. The rain had stopped, leaving streaks on the window that distorted the lights below, just like his memories, blurred and distorted by time and regret. In those early days after leaving, he'd sent money, lots of it. As if dollars could replace bedtime stories and father-daughter dances. Mai had returned every check, her pride stronger than their need. Eventually, he'd stopped trying, throwing himself deeper into his work. The local newspaper from his hometown sat on his desk. He still had it delivered, his one small connection to the life he'd left behind. His eyes caught a familiar name in a small article. The old bookstore, May's pride and joy, was still running. The piece mentioned the owner working 2 jobs to keep it afloat while raising her daughter alone. His throat tightened. Mai had always been stubborn, refusing to give up on her dreams even when times got tough. He remembered how she'd light up talking about her plans for the store, how she wanted it to be more than just a place to buy books, a community hub where stories came alive. Ken's fingers hovered over his phone, May's number still memorized after all these years. He'd never called, though he'd come close many times. What would he say? "Sorry I chose money over our family. Sorry I missed watching our daughter grow up." The words felt hollow even in his mind. A photo frame on his desk showed him shaking hands with the president, his proudest business moment. Next to it, his laptop displayed the latest stock prices, all trending upward. He had everything he dreamed of that morning when he drove away. Yet here he sat, alone in his tower, the weight of his choices pressing down harder than any business responsibility ever had. The cleaning crew had started their nightly rounds, their quiet movements echoing through the empty office. Chen usually stayed late, finding comfort in the solitude of his workspace. But tonight, the silence felt oppressive. He opened his desk drawer, pulling out an old envelope. Inside was a drawing Lin had made the day before he left, stick figures of their family, holding hands under a rainbow. "I love you, Daddy," written in wobbly letters across the top. His assistant knocked softly. "Sir, should I reschedule your evening meetings?" Chen looked up, really seeing his reflection in the window for the first time in years. Gray streaked his temples, lines creased his forehead. When had he gotten so old? What had all this success given him except a front-row seat to watching his life slip away? The town's newspaper caught his eye again. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe somewhere in that small community he'd dismissed as too provincial, his real legacy waited. Not in the glass and steel monument he'd built, but in the family he'd abandoned. His hands shook slightly as he reached for his phone. Not to call, he hadn't earned that right yet. But to do what he should have done years ago, listen. He pulled up the town's social media pages, local news, anything to glimpse the life he'd walked away from, to understand what he'd missed, what he'd thrown away in his blind pursuit of success. The cleaning lady emptied his trash bin, humming softly. She reminded him of Mai, always finding joy in simple moments. How many simple moments had he missed? How many bedtime stories, scraped knees, proud smiles had he traded for board meetings and profit margins? Tomorrow would bring another day of being Chen the billionaire, Chen the business mogul. But tonight, sitting in his dimly lit office, he was just a father who had lost his way. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to find his way back home. Chen closed his laptop, the soft click echoing in the quiet office. For the first time in 15 years, he felt something stir in his chest, not pride in his achievements or satisfaction in his wealth, but hope. Small and fragile, but hope nonetheless. Perhaps it was time for the prodigal father to take the hardest step of all, the first step home. The morning sun hadn't yet risen when Chen's phone rang, piercing the quiet of his penthouse apartment. His assistant's voice trembled on the other end, something he'd never heard before in her usually composed tone. "Sir, I need to tell you something about your daughter." His heart stopped. In 15 years, his assistant had never mentioned Lin. He'd known, somewhere deep down, that she kept tabs on his family, but they'd maintained an unspoken agreement never to discuss it. "Lin, she's in the hospital," she continued softly. "It's serious. The doctors discovered a rare genetic condition." The world tilted on its axis. Chen gripped his phone tighter, memories flooding back of a tiny hand in his, a little voice asking for one more bedtime story. His daughter, his little girl, was sick, and he hadn't been there to notice the first symptoms, to hold her hand during the diagnosis, to support her mother through the fear. Through his assistant's careful explanation, he learned that Mai had been working double shifts at the bookstore and as a night supervisor at the local hotel, trying to cover the mounting medical bills. The small town's hospital wasn't equipped to handle Lin's condition. She needed specialized treatment, the kind that cost more than most people made in a lifetime. Chen stood at his window, watching the city wake up below. The empire he'd built could easily cover any medical expense, but money wasn't the real issue. How could he suddenly appear after 15 years, checkbook in hand, expecting to be welcomed back? His assistant sent him Lin's medical files. Reading through them, his throat tightened. The condition was treatable but required immediate intervention. Time, the very thing he'd wasted for 15 years, was now of the essence. The local news website showed a fundraiser the town had organized for Lin's treatment. The community had rallied around Mai and Lin, raising what they could. It was touching but nowhere near enough. Chen saw photos of his daughter for the first time in years, no longer the little girl from his memories but a young woman, her face pale but determined in the hospital bed. He called his pilot, hands shaking as he packed a bag. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd left with a suitcase 15 years ago, and now he was returning with one. But this time he wasn't running away. He was running towards something far more important than any business deal. The flight to his hometown felt longer than any international business trip. Chen stared out the window, watching clouds pass beneath him. What right did he have to step back into their lives? Would his presence cause more harm than good? But the image of Lin in that hospital bed haunted him. Some choices weren't about rights. They were about responsibilities too long ignored. Landing in the small regional airport felt surreal. Nothing had changed, yet everything was different. The same mountains loomed in the distance, the same fresh air filled his lungs, but he was no longer the ambitious young man who'd left his family behind. The hospital stood on the edge of town, a modest building that hadn't changed much in 15 years. Chen's driver waited as he sat in the car, gathering courage. Through the windows, he could see people coming and going, nurses hurrying between shifts, worried families clutching coffee cups, the normal flow of life and worry that hospitals contained. His phone buzzed, another business crisis demanding attention. For the first time in his career, Chen ignored it. Instead, he pulled up the old family photo on his phone, the one he'd been staring at in his office just days ago. The happy faces stared back at him, frozen in time, unaware of the pain that lay ahead. Taking a deep breath, Chen stepped out of the car. The automatic doors opened with a soft whoosh, and the familiar hospital smell hit him, antiseptic and worry mixed together. At the reception desk, he hesitated. What name should he give? father of the patient, ex-husband, billionaire who abandoned his family? The nurse looked up expectantly. Before Chen could speak, he heard a gasp behind him. Turning, he saw Mai standing there, a coffee cup frozen halfway to her lips. She looked older, tired, with streaks of gray in her hair he'd never seen before. But her eyes, those eyes that had once looked at him with so much love, now held a storm of emotions he couldn't begin to untangle. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Chen opened his mouth, but what could he say? "I'm sorry. I want to help. I should never have left." All the practiced speeches he'd rehearsed on the plane evaporated. Instead, he said the only truth that mattered. "I heard about Lin." May's hand trembled, coffee spilling over the rim of her cup. A passing nurse steadied her, looking between them with concern. The corridor seemed to hold its breath. "You have no right," May started, then stopped, closing her eyes. When she opened them again, there was a steel there that Chen remembered, the strength that had attracted him all those years ago. "But Lin needs help. Help I can't give her. And you've always been good at fixing things with money." The words stung, but Chen accepted them. He deserved worse. This wasn't about him or his guilt or his redemption. This was about Lin, fighting a battle in a hospital room somewhere above them, unaware that her long-lost father had finally come home. Mai turned, gesturing for him to follow. As they walked toward the elevator, Chen noticed her wedding ring was gone, but she still twisted that finger unconsciously. Some habits died harder than others. They had a long road ahead, full of pain and possibly more hurt. But for the first time in 15 years, they were walking it together, united by the one thing that had always mattered most, their daughter. The elevator ride to Lin's floor was the longest 30 seconds of Chen's life. Mai stood beside him, her arms crossed, creating an invisible wall between them. The coffee cup she'd been holding was left behind at the reception desk, forgotten in the shock of his arrival. The quiet beeping of medical equipment grew louder as they approached Lin's room. Mai paused outside the door, turning to face him with eyes that had aged 15 years in worry. "She doesn't know you're coming," she said quietly. "She doesn't know much about you at all." "I never." She trailed off, leaving unspoken all the stories untold, all the questions unanswered. Through the window, Chen caught his first real glimpse of his daughter. She was sitting up in bed, a book propped on her lap, her dark hair falling forward as she read. The same way Mai used to read in their old living room, lost in stories until the world disappeared. "Let me go in first," Mai said, her voice softening slightly. "This isn't going to be easy for her." Chen nodded, his throat too tight for words. He watched through the window as Mai entered the room. Lin looked up, her face lighting up at the sight of her mother. They spoke quietly, Lin's expression changing from confusion to disbelief as Mai gestured toward the door. When Mai beckoned him in, his feet felt like lead. The hospital room was small, decorated with get-well cards and flowers from the townspeople. The medical machines blinked silently, monitoring his daughter's life in ways he'd never been present to do. Lin's eyes met his, her mother's eyes in a face that somehow reflected his own. She didn't smile, didn't cry, just watched him with a mix of curiosity and caution that made his heart ache. "Hello, Lin," he managed, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "You're my father," she said, not a question, not an accusation, just a statement of fact, as clinical as the medical charts hanging by her bed. He nodded, unable to trust his voice again. The room felt too small, too warm, too full of 15 years of absence. A nurse passed by the open door, doing a double take as she recognized him. Word would spread fast in a small town like this. The prodigal billionaire returned at last. He could already imagine the whispers, the judgments, the speculation. "Mom says you can help with the treatment," Lin said, breaking the heavy silence. Her voice was steady, but her fingers twisted the hospital blanket, a nervous gesture she'd inherited from Mai. "Yes," Chen replied, finding his voice again. "There's a specialized clinic in the city. The best doctors, the most advanced treatments. I've already spoken with them." Mai made a small sound, surprise or protest, he couldn't tell. He'd made the calls on the flight over, pulling every string, calling in every favor. Money opened doors, but it was his daughter's name that made him push them open faster than he'd ever moved in business. "And you're just here now?" Lynn asked, a crack appearing in her composed facade. After 15 years, you just walk in because I'm sick. The question hung in the air like a physical thing. Chen took a step forward, then stopped, unsure of his right to approach closer. I should have been here all along, he said simply. No excuses, no justifications, just truth. A commotion in the hallway drew their attention. A small crowd had gathered, peering through the window. Nurses, other patients, visitors. The prodigal's return was already becoming a spectacle. Mai moved to close the blinds, protecting their privacy with the same fierce instinct she'd always shown. The room felt smaller with the outside world shut away, more intimate, more dangerous. Why now? Lynn pressed, her voice stronger. Why not when I graduated high school? Or when Mom's store almost went under? Or when I got accepted to college? Each milestone hit Chen like a physical blow. Moments he should have witnessed, celebrations he should have shared, hardships he should have helped shoulder. I can't change the past, he said quietly. But I'm here now, if you'll let me help. Lynn looked at her mother, a silent conversation passing between them that Chen couldn't read. Mai had always been better at understanding their daughter, even when she was tiny. Another skill he'd never learned. The treatment, Lynn said finally. Tell me about it. For the next hour, Chen explained the medical details he'd memorized on the flight. Lynn listened intently, asking sharp questions that reminded him of himself in business meetings. Mai stood by the window, silent but watchful, her presence both a comfort and a reminder of all he'd thrown away. As the afternoon light began to fade, a doctor appeared with medication for Lynn. The familiar routine of hospital life broke their bubble of tension. Lynn's eyes were getting heavy. The medication always made her drowsy, Mai explained quietly. You should get some rest, Mai told their daughter, adjusting her pillows with practiced care. Lynn nodded, already drifting off, but her eyes found Chen's one last time. Will you? She paused, uncertainty flickering across her face. Will you be here tomorrow? Yes, Chen promised, putting everything he had into that one word. I'll be here. As they left the room, Mai turned to him in the hallway. She's giving you a chance, she said softly. Don't waste it this time. Chen watched through the window as their daughter slept, looking younger and more vulnerable in rest. Outside, the town continued to buzz with news of his return. But here, in this quiet hospital corridor, none of that mattered. He had a second chance, not to fix the past, but to be present for the future. And this time, he wouldn't walk away. The top-tier medical center gleamed in the morning sun, its glass and steel structure a stark contrast to the small-town hospital they'd left behind. Chen had arranged everything: private transportation, immediate admission, a team of specialists waiting. But as they walked through the automatic doors, he realized money couldn't buy the one thing that mattered most: his daughter's trust. Lynn wheeled her own chair, refusing help from both her parents. Her determination showed in the set of her jaw, another trait she'd inherited from him. Mai walked beside her, carrying a small bag of their belongings, her face tight with worry and exhaustion. The admission process was smooth. Chen's name opened doors without question, but when the nurse asked about family medical history, the awkward silence that followed spoke volumes. Chen couldn't answer basic questions about his daughter's childhood illnesses or previous health issues. Mai filled in the gaps, her quiet voice steady as she recounted years of information he should have known. The specialist will see you now, a nurse announced, leading them to a consultation room. The doctor, a distinguished woman with kind eyes, explained the treatment plan in detail. Chen watched Lynn's face as she absorbed the information: 6 months of intensive therapy, experimental treatments, regular monitoring. The road ahead would be long and challenging. I understand you'll be staying nearby? The doctor asked, looking at Chen. Mei's head snapped up. This was news to her. Chen cleared his throat. I've rented an apartment close to the medical center. For all of us, if you want, he added quickly, looking at Mai. Separate rooms, of course. It would make the daily treatments easier. Lynn's fingers tightened on her wheelchair's armrests. Mom can't leave the bookstore for 6 months, she protested. And I can manage on my own. The store, Mai began, but Chen interrupted. I've arranged for temporary management. Full salary continuation, plus coverage for all operating costs. He met Mei's startled gaze. I know how much the store means to you both. I wouldn't ask you to give it up. May's expression softened slightly, the first crack in her armor he'd seen since his return. The bookstore had been her dream long before they'd met, and he'd once promised to help make it succeed. At least he could finally keep that promise, even if 15 years late. The day progressed in a whirlwind of tests, consultations, and paperwork. Chen handled everything efficiently, the way he managed his business empire. But efficiency couldn't bridge the emotional gaps. When Lin needed help changing into a hospital gown, she turned to May. When she was scared before a procedure, she reached for her mother's hand, not his. During one of the breaks between tests, Chen found himself alone with Mai in the waiting room. She looked exhausted, the weight of years of single parenthood visible in the shadows under her eyes. "You didn't have to do all this," she said quietly. "Yes, I did." He stared at his coffee cup, untouched and growing cold. "I know it doesn't make up for anything." "No, it doesn't." May's voice was gentle but firm. She needed a father, not a financial solution. The truth of those words hit harder than any business setback he'd ever faced. Money had always been his answer to everything. But sitting here, watching his daughter fight for her health, he realized how little it really meant. Late afternoon brought the first treatment session. Lin sat bravely as the medical team explained the procedure, but Chen saw fear flash in her eyes. Without thinking, he moved closer to her chair. "Would you like me to stay?" he asked softly. Lin hesitated, then gave a small nod. It wasn't forgiveness or acceptance, but it was something. Chen took a seat nearby, close enough to be present, but far enough to give her space. The treatment was difficult. Lin tried to hide her discomfort, but Chen saw every wince, every masked expression of pain. Mai held their daughter's hand while Chen sat helplessly, understanding for the first time that some things couldn't be fixed with wealth or power. After the session, they moved to the apartment Chen had arranged. It was spacious and comfortable, with separate areas for privacy. Lin disappeared into her room almost immediately, exhausted from the day's events. Chen found himself on the balcony, looking out over the city lights. Mai joined him, holding 2 cups of tea. She still remembered how he liked it. "She's stronger than you know," Mai said, handing him a cup. "She gets that from you." "No," Chen replied. "She gets it from you. You're the one who raised her to be strong." A moment of understanding passed between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of something new. "The store's security cameras," Mai said suddenly. "They caught you sometimes, late at night, looking through the window." Chen stiffened. He'd thought no one knew about those moments of weakness, when he'd drive hours just to see the bookstore's lights, imagining the life he'd walked away from. "Why didn't you ever come in?" "I didn't deserve to," he answered honestly. Mai sipped her tea, considering his words. "And now?" "Now I know I still don't deserve it. But Lin needs both of us, and I won't walk away again." Inside, they'd heard Lin's door open, followed by quiet footsteps to the kitchen. Both parents turned, ready to help if needed, united for the first time in 15 years by their daughter's needs. The path to redemption would be long, Chen realized. It would cost more than money. It would demand his time, his presence, his heart. But watching Mai go inside to help their daughter, he knew it was a price he was finally ready to pay. The treatment room was quiet except for the steady hum of medical equipment. Lin sat in her usual chair, watching the medication drip through the IV line. Chen had brought his laptop, trying to catch up on work, but he couldn't focus. After 3 weeks of treatments, the silence between them felt heavier than usual. "Did you ever think about us?" Lin's question cut through the quiet, sharp and sudden. Chen closed his laptop slowly, his heart pounding. He'd been waiting for this conversation, dreading it, knowing it needed to happen. "Yes," he answered truthfully, "every day." "Then why?" Lin's voice cracked slightly. "Why didn't you come back? Why didn't you call? Even just a letter?" The medical machines beeped steadily, marking time as Chen struggled to find the right words. Not excuses, she deserved better than that. "I told myself I was doing the right thing," he began, "building something important, creating a legacy. But those were lies I told myself to make it easier. Easier to forget us? Easier to ignore how much I was hurting you and your mother." Mai, who had been pretending to read a book in the corner, looked up. Her eyes met Chen's across the room, years of unspoken pain passing between them. "Do you know what it was like?" Lynn continued, her voice growing stronger. Watching other kids with their dads at school events? Having to make up stories about where you were? Pretending I didn't care when people pitied us? Each word hit Chen like a physical blow. He'd imagined their lives over the years, but hearing the reality was different. Harder. I used to wait by the window on my birthday, Lynn said quietly. Mom thought I was watching for my friends, but I was watching for you. I kept thinking, maybe this year. Maybe this is when he'll come back. May made a small sound like she was holding back tears. She'd never told him this, never mentioned how their daughter had waited, hoped, been disappointed year after year. The hardest part wasn't you leaving, Lynn continued, her hands twisting in her lap. It was feeling like I wasn't enough reason for you to stay. Lynn, no. Chen moved closer to her chair. It was never about you not being enough. I was the one who wasn't enough. Not enough of a father, not enough of a husband. I was scared of failing you both, so I ran towards something I thought I couldn't fail at. Money, Lynn said flatly. Success, Chen corrected. Recognition. Things that seemed important but were worthless compared to what I left behind. The IV machine beeped, signaling the end of this round of treatment. A nurse came in to disconnect the lines, her movements efficient and practiced. When she left, the tension in the room remained. Tell him about the science fair, May said suddenly. Lynn looked at her mother in surprise. Mom. He should know. Tell him. Lynn sighed, then straightened in her chair. I won the National Science Fair last year. Created a program that helps small businesses compete with bigger corporations. A bitter smile crossed her face. Ironic, right? Chen felt pride and pain mix in his chest. That's incredible. Mom worked extra shifts to buy the computer parts I needed. We couldn't afford new ones, so I learned to rebuild old machines. The local computer shop owner taught me for free. Each detail was another reminder of what he'd missed, what his family had accomplished without him. The community had stepped up where he had stepped away. I saw your name in business magazines sometimes, Lynn admitted. People at school would ask if we were related. I always said no. The words hurt, but Chen understood. I wouldn't have claimed me either. A moment of silence passed, heavy with honesty. Then Lynn spoke again, her voice softer. I haven't forgiven you yet. I know. But, she hesitated. I'm glad you're here now. For Mom especially. She pretends she's fine, but this has been hard on her too. May looked up sharply, but Lynn continued. I've watched her work herself to exhaustion, never complaining, never giving up. She deserves better than that. Chen looked at his former wife, really looked at her. The strength that had raised their daughter alone, the dignity that had refused his money but never his daughter's right to know her father, the grace that was allowing him this chance at redemption. Your mother, he said slowly, is the strongest person I've ever known. Mai brushed away a tear, trying to hide it. Lynn reached out and took her hand. The doctors say the treatment is working, Lynn said after a moment. But healing this, us, that's going to take longer, isn't it? Chen nodded. As long as you need. I'm not going anywhere this time. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, catching the edge of Lynn's ivy stand, making it glow like gold. Outside, life went on. Business deals were made, money changed hands, empires rose and fell. But in this room, something more valuable was happening. Truth was being spoken, pain was being acknowledged, and a family was beginning the long journey of healing. Mai stood up, gathering their things as the session ended. Ready to go home. Home. The apartment wasn't perfect, but they were together. For now, that would have to be enough. Lynn nodded, allowing Chen to help her into the wheelchair for the first time since treatments began. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the first step on a very long road. 3 months into Lynn's treatment, a familiar face appeared at the medical center. It was the owner of the computer shop from their hometown, carrying a laptop he'd rebuilt specially for Lynn. Chen watched from the doorway as his daughter's face lit up at the surprise visit. The whole town misses you, the shop owner said, setting up the laptop on Lynn's bedside table. We've been taking turns keeping the bookstore running, just like your mom taught us. May, who had been organizing Lynn's medications, smiled softly. They didn't have to do that. That's what community means, the shop owner replied, giving Chen a pointed look. Word had spread about Chen's return and his efforts to help not just his own family, but others in the town facing similar medical struggles. He'd established a foundation to help families with medical expenses, but he was learning that money wasn't the only form of wealth. Later that afternoon, Chen found himself in the hospital cafeteria with the computer shop owner. "You know, your daughter has quite a gift," the man said, stirring his coffee. "She reminds me of you, back when you were just starting out, before the money changed things." Chen remembered those days, working late in that same computer shop, dreaming big dreams while fixing broken machines. "I forgot what really mattered." "But you're remembering now," the man nodded. "That's something." The next week brought more visitors from their hometown. The local baker brought Lin's favorite cookies. The librarian carried a stack of new books. Each visitor brought not just gifts, but stories, memories of Lin growing up, of May's strength, of a community that had become family in Chen's absence. During one of Lin's treatment sessions, Chen noticed her working intently on her new laptop. "What are you designing?" he asked, genuinely curious. "A better system for the bookstore," she replied, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "Mom's old inventory program is outdated, and with all these people helping out, they need something more efficient." Chen moved closer, looking at the code on her screen. It was elegant, innovative. She had his mind for problem solving, but her mother's understanding of people's needs. Would you like help with that?" he offered hesitantly. Lin paused, then nodded, shifting the laptop so he could see better. For the next hour, father and daughter worked together, combining his business experience with her fresh perspective. Mai watched them from her usual spot, a small smile playing at her lips. The program they created together soon expanded beyond just the bookstore. Other small businesses in town began asking to use it. Chen saw an opportunity, not for profit, but for redemption. "We should make it free for small businesses," he suggested one evening. "Help level the playing field." Lin looked at him with surprise. "Really? But you could make millions selling it." "Some things are worth more than money," he replied, and meant it. The news spread through their hometown. The man who had left to build an empire was using that same drive to help the community he'd once abandoned. But more importantly, he was building something with his daughter. One day, while Lin was resting between treatments, Mai found Chen on the hospital roof, looking out over the city. "The foundation you started," she said, joining him at the railing. "It's helping the Taylor family afford their son's surgery." Chen nodded. The Taylors had been regular customers at May's bookstore. Their son's medical condition had nearly bankrupted them. "You're different," May observed. "The man who left would have thrown money at the problem and walked away. But you're actually involved, listening to what people need." "I learned from the best," he said, glancing at her. "You always understood that a community is more than just transactions." A comfortable silence fell between them. Below, the city bustled, but up here, they could just breathe. Lin's latest test results came back, May said finally. "The treatment's working better than expected." Chen let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. That's wonderful." "She wants to go back to college next semester," Mai continued. "But she also wants to keep working on the business program you two created." "Whatever she wants," Chen said immediately. "I'll support her either way." Mai smiled. "That's what being a parent is, supporting them while they find their own path." The door to the roof opened and Lin appeared, moving more steadily now as her strength returned. "The computer shop owner is video calling," she announced. "He says more businesses want to try our program. And," she hesitated, looking at Chen, "he thinks you should come back to town, see how things have changed." Chen looked at Mai, then back at their daughter. The thought of returning to the town he'd left, facing the people he'd abandoned, it was terrifying, but necessary. "We could all go," he suggested carefully. "When you're stronger. See how the bookstore is doing." Lin's face brightened. "Mom's birthday is next month. We could." She trailed off, realizing she'd just invited her father to her mother's birthday celebration. But Mai didn't object, and Chen felt hope bloom in his chest. They stood together on the roof, a family slowly healing, while below them, a community waited, not with judgment, but with the possibility of forgiveness. Chen had learned that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the connections we build, the trust we earn, and the love we choose to give and receive. The sun was setting, painting the sky in colors no amount of money could buy. Lynn took a photo with her phone, capturing the moment. Not perfect, but real. And sometimes, real was better than perfect. The university auditorium buzzed with excitement as families filled the seats for the graduation ceremony. Chen adjusted his tie nervously, sitting beside Mai in the third row. It had been 2 years since that first day in the hospital, and today marked more than just Lynn's college graduation. "Stop fidgeting," Mai whispered, a hint of amusement in her voice. "She already said you could be here." Chen nodded, but his hands still trembled slightly. The right to attend his daughter's graduation wasn't something he took for granted. He'd missed her high school ceremony, but this time was different. This time he'd earned his place. The bookstore had flourished under their combined efforts. Lynn's software program, now used by small businesses across the country, remained free. Chen's way of giving back to the community that had supported his family when he couldn't. More importantly, it was something he and Lynn had built together, bridging years of absence with lines of code and shared purpose. The ceremony began, and Chen's heart swelled as Lynn walked across the stage. Her medical treatments had ended successfully a year ago, but watching her move with such strength and confidence still felt like a miracle. When they called her name, announcing her summa cum laude honors in computer science and business, Chen wasn't ashamed of the tears that fell. Mai reached over and squeezed his hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. They weren't back together romantically, but they'd found a new kind of friendship, bound by their love for their daughter and the understanding that some bridges, while broken, could be rebuilt differently. After the ceremony, they found Lynn among the crowd of graduates. She was radiant in her cap and gown, clutching her diploma. When she saw them, she did something that stopped Chen's heart. She ran to him first, throwing her arms around him in a hug. "You did it," he whispered, holding his daughter close. "We did it," she corrected, reaching out to pull Mai into the embrace. "All of us." The moment was interrupted by familiar voices. The computer shop owner, the librarian, the baker, half the town had made the journey to celebrate Lynn's graduation. They'd brought food, gifts, and most importantly, their presence. The same community that had watched Lynn grow up was here to see her succeed. Later, at the celebration dinner Chen had arranged at Lynn's favorite restaurant, he stood to make a toast. The words he prepared suddenly felt inadequate. "I once thought success meant building something big," he began, looking at the faces around the table. "Creating an empire that would last. But I was wrong. True success is sitting here, watching my daughter graduate, surrounded by people who never gave up on her or on her mother." He turned to Mai. "You built something far more valuable than I ever did. You built a family, a community, a home. And somehow you found it in your heart to let me be part of it again." Lynn wiped away tears as Chen continued. "And to my daughter, you're stronger than I ever was. You faced illness with courage, pursued your dreams with determination, and found room in your heart for forgiveness. I don't deserve to be called your father, but I promise to spend the rest of my life trying to earn that title." The computer shop owner raised his glass. "To Lynn?" "To Lynn," the room echoed. After dinner, they walked through the campus together, the spring evening warm and full of promise. Lynn linked arms with both her parents, something she'd started doing recently. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what's next." Chen held his breath waiting. Lynn had received job offers from major tech companies, including his own. "I want to expand the software program," she continued. "Make it better, reach more small businesses. But I want to do it from home, from our town." Mai smiled. The bookstore could use a full-time tech expert. "And a business partner." Lynn looked at her mother hopefully. "2 business partners," Chen added quietly. "If you'll have me." Lynn stopped walking, turning to face him. "You'd leave your company, move back to our small town." "I've already started the process," Chen admitted. "The board wasn't happy, but they'll manage. I've missed enough of life's important moments chasing the wrong kind of success." The campus bell tower chimed in the distance, marking the hour. Students hurried past, caught up in their own stories of beginnings and endings. But here, under the spreading oak trees, 3 people who had once been broken found themselves building something new. "Dad," Lynn said softly, the words still new and precious between them. "Thank you for coming back." "Thank you for letting me," he replied. Mai touched his arm gently. "Just don't leave again." "Never." Chen promised, and this time they all knew he meant it. They walked back to their cars, where the townspeople waited to begin the journey home. Chen watched as Lin hugged her friends, laughed with her neighbors, belonged to this community in a way he was just beginning to understand. The bookstore would need renovations to accommodate their new business venture. The software would need updating. The foundation he'd started would need attention, but for the first time in his life, Chen wasn't thinking about the next big thing. He was thinking about tomorrow, about watching his daughter build her dreams, about being there for the small moments he'd missed for so long. As they drove back to town, following the familiar roads home, Chen realized that sometimes the biggest successes come from the smallest choices, the choice to stay, to try again, to love without conditions. His empire might be smaller now, but his world had never been bigger. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of hope, and somewhere between the university and their small town, a father finally found his way home.